paper wings in the rain's first drop fell like a held breath finally released. They had walked all night beneath aurora-lit vaults and constellations that rearranged themselves at a thought. Yet at the edge of the gate's far side, the sky sobered into cloud, and the world remembered weather. The apprentices stepped from starlit bridges onto a narrow isthmus of slate. Beyond it stretched a quiet city of cranes and wine-bent chimneys, its roof scalloped in tin, its alleys stitched with clotheslines. Rain approached over the rooftops in a gray sweep, soft as apology. Prometheus stood with them, the storm's scent gathering in his hair like iron and sage. Not all lessons arrive as thunder, he said. Some come folded small. They found the first fold on a windowsill, a paper crane, no larger than a thumb, creased with impossible care. It twitched, then, as if remembering the idea of flight, it lifted and shivered through the damp air, leaving a thin silver thread behind memory-turned filament. The thread hummed a single note, the pitch of an almost forgotten promise. More cranes stirred. From gutters, shop awnings, and schoolroom panes they rose paper geese, moths, kites, tiny prowling wolves made from receipts and homework margins, even a chandelier of origami stars, each marked with graphite wishes. As the rain met them, the ink began to blur and run, and every creature sang a different tone: regret, bravery, apology, longing. The city became an orchestra of wet paper and weather. Lyra lifted her hands, rain stippling her lashes. There, words, she said softly. Words no one dared to say. Prometheus nodded. Welcome to Mistral Ward, where unfinished confessions learn to fly. A bell tolled, and the ward answered. Shutters clacked, boots splashed, laughter ran like quicksilver through drains. Yet no human face appeared. Only the paper creatures pressed near, seeking warmth like strays. Torin reached for a fox folded from a theater ticket. It nosed his knuckles, then collapsed, ink bleeding into his palm in a single sentence. I was brave only after it was safe. The fox refolded itself, lighter somehow, and darted up his arm to perch on his shoulder, a companion made of admission. Eamon tilted his head to the sky. The rain's tempo shifted to a delicate patter, then to a hurried whisper. He heard intervals, minor sevenths, unresolved chords like a lullaby that refused to end. The storm is reading us, he murmured, or we are reading it. The rain remembers how we fold ourselves, Prometheus said. It invites us to open. They stepped into the ward, and the ward unfolded them, streets braided and unbraided. Alleys became corridors of damp parchment strung with lanterns that burned with the light of bedside secrets. A shop window displayed nothing but envelopes, each sealed with a drop of clear resin. A brass placard swung over a doorway. The Aviary of Unsent letters. Inside, warmth. The ceiling vaulted like a breastbone. Rafters carried rows of origami birds hung by red thread. A woman with ink-stained fingers, perhaps 30, perhaps centuries, looked up from a kettle. Storm walkers, she said, pouring tea that smelled of rain on stone. Orchestras loud today. You must have brought a squall of could-haves. Lyra cradled the cup. What do we owe? Only what you withhold, the woman said. Right, fold asterisk, only what you withhold, the woman said. Right, fold, and let the rain decide. She set a tray on the counter. Thin sheets of fibered paper, soft as breath. Little stones for weights, threads the color of dusk. Beside them lay quills already wet with ink, the shade of storm clouds. The shop smelled like cedar drawers and the first page of a new book. Lyra picked up a sheet. Its surface warmed to her touch, as if recognizing a pulse. Words tugged at her tongue, the ones she had dodged for years. I left before you could ask me to stay. I called it duty, it was fear. She wrote without looking at Prometheus, folded the paper into a lark, and set it in her palm. The lark trembled, then opened one wing. Rain leaked through a crack in the roof and kissed its back. The ink blurred not away, but inward, stitching the confession through the paper like veins. The lark stood taller. Its voice, when it sang, was clear and small and impossibly brave. Torin's hand hovered over the tray. What if what I owe is heavy? Then folded many times, the woman said gently. Small doesn't mean lesser. Small means carryable. He wrote. I mistook loudness for courage. Fold by fold, the admission became a beetle with hammered-looking wing cases. When the rain touched it, the shell didn't disintegrate. It deepened to a pearl-dark sheen. The beetle clicked contentedly and crawled up his sleeve, a quiet armor. Eamon waited, listening to the roof's drumbeat. What if I don't know the right words? Then write the wrong ones honestly, Prometheus said. The rain reads truth more than grammar, Eamon wrote haltingly. I want to help because I want to belong. His paper became a kite with a tail of unfinished commas. He let it go. The kite rose, wobbled, and steadied, the commas fluttering into tiny swallows that circled his head and settled. In his hair like warm punctuation, storms cresting, the woman warned, glancing at a barometer shaped like a sleeping eye. When the pupil opens, the smudger wakes, Lyra frowned. The smudger, the part of the rain that erases, the woman said. It hunts for what's been written to perform, not to confess. If you carry paper wings soaked in vanity or invention, it will blur you until you can't tell what you meant. As if called, the bell over the door quivered. A draft slipped in, cold enough to taste. Outside, the alleys had narrowed into seams. Paper creatures pressed against the aviary's windows, their wings twitching. Somewhere a gutter choir shifted from hum to warning. Prometheus set his cup down. We'll need to cross the ward before the smudger thickens. There's a bridge at the far sluices Bellweir. It opens only for those who carry their own weather. We have paper, Torin said, and a storm. Then we have enough, Prometheus answered. They stepped back into the rain. It had fattened into a fine needle-threading drizzle, the kind that stitches every exposed thought to skin. The city reassembled around them, streets folding and unfolding like bellows. From the eaves, handwritten receipts shook themselves into cranes and joined the stream of skyward flight. The apprentices moved with it, each newly folded creature, orbiting its maker like a modest moon. At the first corner, the smudger showed itself, a darker density within the rain, as if a thumb had pressed the sky and left a print. Wherever it passed, the inked wishes on window cranes smeared into gray sighs. A fox made of sheet music yelped and blurred. Lyra knelt, cupping it. Not yet, she whispered. Not today. She tore a thin strip from her sleeve and bound the fox's tail. The cloth wicked away the worst of the wet, and the notes reappeared, softer but true. The smudger isn't evil, Eamon said, surprised to hear himself mean it. It's correction without listening, rain without reading, Prometheus said. Keep moving. They threaded the Mistral stairs, slate steps arcing over a canal where umbrellas floated like ink blots. On a landing, a boy of paper stood, folded from a detention slip, eyes punched as to small holes. He held out his hands, which were margins scribbled with I'm fine. The smudger's edge lapped at his toes. Lyra offered her lark. Sing with him, she said to it. The lark hopped to the boy's shoulder and poured a thin ribbon of sound into the hollow between his paper ribs. The words on his chest bled, then rewrote themselves. I am scared. He nodded, creased head against creased shoulder, and stepped into the procession. At Gutter Market, the rain thickened. Stalls of string and salt collapsed into neat stacks. The aviary's cousins, the bindery, the house of indexed echoes, shut their shutters with tidy finality. The smudger spread like a low fog, testing edges. Torin's beetle tapped a rhythm on his knuckles, slow, then quick, then slow again. What is it? Torin asked. Listen, Eamon said, and for once his uncertainty was an instrument. He lifted the kite string. The commas on its tail vibrated, lining up like notes on a staff. It's telling us where not to step. They followed the beetle's tapping, and the commas trembled through the fog, skirting places where letters vanished underfoot. Twice, the smudger lunged, once from gutter, once in a veer of rain that turned alley into curtain. Each time, Prometheus lifted a palm. Fire did not blaze. Instead, moisture gathered and beaded along unseen lines, outlining the shape of the wind itself. He leaned into that shape, parted it, and the smudger slipped past like a tide missing the shore. Bellweir. Ahead, the woman from the aviary called. She had followed them unseen, now reappearing with a lantern that burned with inside weather. But the bridge won't lower unless carried truth outweighs carried pride. They stood before it, a span of planks thin as ribs, hinged to a tower of rain-slick brick. Letters drifted in the air above the sluice alphabet soup of vows, apologies, beginnings. A carved plaque read, Weigh your weather. A scale hung from the gantry. On one plate, a blank page sealed in glass. On the other, an open page, rain darkened, still wet with ink. Left is what you plan to write, Prometheus said. Right is what you already have. Torin stepped first, placing his beetle on the wet page. The scale dipped. The bridge groaned. One notch. Lyra set her lark beside it. The needle swung further, steady. Eamon unspooled his kite. The commas fluttered down, small as gnats, and nested on the same plate. The bridge shivered and locked into place. Together now, Prometheus said. They crossed. Halfway, the smudger surged, thick and near, licking at the edge of the planks. The paper boy faltered, his I am scared blurring at the corners. I'll carry it with you, Lyra said, taking his hand. The lark lifted, dropping a bead of rain from its beak onto the word am. The verb darkened, held. Torrens stood between the smudger and the procession. He didn't shout. He breathed the old word drawn inward into a steadying hush. The beetle's rhythm spread through him, into the bridge, boards that might have rattled set like notes in a chord. The smudger hesitated at that calm. Eamon looked up. The storm's pupil, the sleeping eye barometer of the whole ward, quivered, then opened. A single clean tone rang through Mistral. He felt it in his teeth, in his kite string, in the commas that had learned to be swallows. Now, he whispered. The last stretch of bridge unfurled. They ran lightly over it, rain writing quick syllables around their ankles. The gatehouse door opened onto a small room with a stove, a ledger, and a chair that had taught dozens of backs to wait. Inside, dry air smelled of wool and old twine. The smudger hit the door after them, thudded like a wet moth, and slid away. Silence arrived like a blessing. In it, their paper companions rearranged themselves, the beetle tucking under Torrens' collarbone, the lark roosting in Lyra's hair, the kite tilting to sleep against Eamon's shoulder. The paper boy sat on the dry floor and slowly unfolded himself one crease, then another until he was only a letter again, lined and legible. He placed himself in the ledger's first blank page. What happens to him? Lyra asked. He waits for the one it was meant for, the Aviary woman said, setting her lantern down. Or the rain delivers him to the mouth that needs to say it most. Prometheus warmed his hands over the stove's quiet heat. Paper wings don't survive the rain by staying dry, he said. They survive by being honest enough for the rain to carry. Outside, the storm softened to a listening drizzle. Somewhere, the smudger thinned to mist and then to memory. Bellweir's far door swung inward, revealing a street of slate washed clean, and beyond it a sky trying on blue. Lyra smiled without showing teeth. What's next? Prometheus looked at their hands, ink-stained, damp, steady. Next we learn to fly without wind, he said. But first, we deliver a letter. He lifted the ledger. On its open page, the paper boy's confession shone. None of them knew the name at the top. All of them recognized the ache at the bottom. They stepped out into the rain's aftertaste, the city's chimneys steaming like contented beasts. Above, dozens of cranes circled, each bearing its scrap of truth like a heart. The apprentices lifted their companions to the air, paper wings, beat, held, and despite the rain rose, they sent the ledger into the sky like a small, solemn boat. The cranes angled, catching its weight on a wind that smelled faintly of lemon and old books, and lifted it toward a row of windows where, weeks ago, a woman had set a teacup in the wrong place and never quite been able to put it right again. The city rearranged itself to receive the little voyage. Clotheslines bowed, chimneys exhaled. A child paused mid-skip and held out an open palm as if to feel the passage of something too private for noise. The paper wings, each humming its own softened confession, threaded through alleys and over tile, guided by whatever small gravity favors truth. They did not seek applause. They sought particular doorways. A brass knocker answered the ledger's thud. The door within opened on a man with a face like folded maps, creases of regret, an atlas of mischances at the corners of his eyes. He looked at the ledger, at the neat handwriting where the paper boy had been, and his hands trembled. He did not read aloud. He did not need to. He let a small thing happen instead. He sat at a table, smoothed his palm over the page, and allowed the confession to be true in the shape of his chest. Across the lane, a washerwoman paused, hand buried in suds, when an origami moth ink blurred to silver settled on her wrist. The moth's tiny wings opened and somewhere between two beats a memory unbent. A daughter's lullaby hummed in a victim's voice, the melody a truth she had kept in her teeth for 20 years. The moth folded and flew. She wiped her hands on her apron and began a letter on the back of a receipt, her script a slow repair. Prometheus watched these small civilities with a thin, secret smile. They want to be useful, not famous, he told the apprentices. Let them find their doors. If a confession is true, it will fit. They followed the ledger's trail until the cranes, obedient as old friends, dipped and dropped it onto a narrow sill high above the market. From below, a man who mended clocks looked up. He had been hollow since his wife's name had stopped coming easily to mind. He climbed, slow and careful as someone returning to speech, and read. The ledger did not heal him. It did not claim to. It offered him an ache with a name, and that small naming loosened something like a latch inside his chest. He wept there, quietly, as a practiced, private insect of grief should, with the industry of repair. They lingered, not to celebrate but to learn. The aviary woman brewed more tea. You will meet two kinds of letters, she told them when they returned, those that begin repair and those that begin ruin. Both need reading. One asks for hands, the other asks for caution. A bell tolled across the ward soft, like a spoon against a cup hand. The apprentices set about the first task the ledger had asked without asking them. Return what must be returned, mend what could be mended, make room for apologies and awkward courage. They walked rooftops and stoops. They delivered small packages and stranger small mercies. The paper companions behaved like faithful weather, sometimes sudden, sometimes patient, but always honest. Even the city shifted in response. A boarded-up bookshop unlatched its window and a boy slipped inside to find a tome with a dog-eared poem about leaving and returning. He read it aloud, and his voice, rough with practice, taught an older patron how to say "come home" without the ache of command. A shoemaker found under his stall a kite whose tail spelled forgive in half-smudged commas. He mended solace with the tenderness that could have been learned at the heart of the gate itself. Not all outcomes were pretty. In the narrowest court, a folded Volf delivered an accusation long preserved between two sisters. It did not soothe, it burned, and hands were raised, and names were spoken like knives. For a night the court echoed with a different kind of music, shouts, then apologies, then a longer silence heavy enough to be useful. The apprentices stood outside that doorway and waited, learning the shape of patience that cannot rush apology. By dusk the rain had become the kind of soft that keeps secrets between friends. The paper companions gathered at the aviary's rafters, clustered like tired birds, edges dulled but spirits intact. The ledger lay open on the counter. New lines leaned against it like small, bright reeds. The paper boy's confession now held not as an object but as a thing that had traveled and asked, had done what confessions do when they are permitted to be raw. It changed the pattern of several lives without pronouncing their end. Prometheus cleaned ash from a small pan and looked at the apprentices the way one inspects seedlings grown in a careful row. There is a danger here, he said, not unkindly. Not all truth repairs. Some truths make rooms colder. Part of our work is to teach how to warm them afterward. Lyra, ink still on her fingers, folded another tiny crane and let it go. It traced a lazy orbit and settled on a lamppost where an old woman would find it and, with shaking hands, press it into the palm of an old man who had stopped going to plays. Why a play? He would ask. Because you once loved the sound of someone else crying in the dark, she would answer. The paper would not argue. It would only offer a doorway. Night came and the cranes roosted, but the city smelled different, as if a few stitches had been taken where wide seams once gaped. The apprentices slept in the aviary, their dreams thin and stitched with the small, bright threads of the day. Prometheus kept watch at the window, listening to the rain count off small returns. When the hour thinned into something like a new habit, Lyra awoke and found a small paper swan at her bedside. It was blank inside, waiting. Someone had left it with intent. She traced the curve of its neck and felt, beneath the paper's skin, a pressure as if the city asked her to write the next line. She stood, folded a sheet from the tray, and wrote, "If you are reading this, know that I waited until I was afraid. No more." She paused, unsure whether the sentence was true. Then she folded the swan with hands that held the exact memory of the gate's light, careful, deliberate, patient. The swan opened one wing and pulsed. Outside, a faint bell answered, another ledger finding its porch, another confession naming itself aloud. The apprentices dressed and followed. Prometheus closed the aviary's door with a soft clap. We cannot fix every ledger, he said, nor would we want to. Our work is simpler, to carry what cannot remain secret, and to leave the rest to weather, and to courage. They walked into a city that had learned to clear a small space for truth. Paper wings fluttered above, now less afraid of rain than of being in red. Somewhere, distant, the gates arched far beyond Mistral Ward, far beyond any roofline they could see, thinned like a memory and hummed, as if hearing the ripple of small, deliberate repair. Lyra's swan sailed, It found a porch with a chipped teacup and a woman who had been keeping her grief in the shape of polite routines. The swan landed, and the woman read. A single breath broke, not dramatic, only human, the shape of an apology, or a beginning. She stood and went to the kitchen to make more tea, because occupying the joints of a life again is a kind of repair. Prometheus looked at the apprentices, at their damp sleeves and small birds, and for the first time since they had entered the gate, he allowed a laugh that was almost proud. "You've learned to fold weather," he said. "Wear it well." Aemon, holding the remains of his kite's tail, looked up at the thinning clouds and wondered aloud, will they always find the right doors? Prometheus tilted his head. Not always, he admitted. Sometimes a letter is misplaced, and sometimes a confession is welcomed like a coat in winter. The point is not certainty, it is practice. Keep going. They kept going, through the ward, over Bellweir, across slate and gutter. The apprentices pushed the small, blunt work of care. They delivered and collected, mended and listened, and the city, in its slow way, learned the grammar of being returned to one another. When the last paper wing settled for the night and the ledger's pages had absorbed enough weather to be wisdom, Prometheus led them away from Mistral Ward toward a lane of low lamps. There, beneath the dovecotes, a child waited with a shoebox full of folded cranes, each one a hope. The child's eyes were bright and empty the way small hands are when they haven't been taught to hold a truth. Lyra knelt, and the child placed a crane in her palm. "Can they fly when you're small?" the child asked. "They fly when someone reads them," Lyra answered, and she tucked the paper into her sleeve to carry for one more door. The gate far, inscrutable, sang in the distance like an instrument tuned to patience. The apprentices had taken one lesson from its arches and test. Unfinished journeys keep asking. Paper wings, if made with honest hands, will keep learning how to fly in rain. Dawn would find Mistral Ward damp but quieter. It would find people who had remembered how to say an awkward thing. It would find a ledger lighter by one secret and heavier by another, both useful weights, and when the apprentices returned to the gate later, they would carry not only inked pages but a new patience shaped from the slow geometry of apologies and mended roofs. For now, they walked on, paper companions tucked like small, living talismans, each fold a promise to return when weather required it, because some journeys do not end at the gate. They begin there, with a small, fearless fold and the willingness to let the rain read what we mean. Dawn came as a slow, generous thing, not the sudden trumpet of some herald but the careful unbuttoning of a coat. Mistral Ward smelled of wet paper and tea and small, mended things. The apprentices walked back toward the gate with hands that had learned the weight of other people's sentences. Their pockets were lighter for what they'd let go, heavier for what they'd taken on. Prometheus walked with them, not in front, not behind, but the way a compass lives inside a chest. They did not speak at once. Speech felt newly private, as if the night had taught them how to be careful with tongues. Where before the gate had shimmered like a promise, now it seemed to listen, the stone breathing in the rhythm of the city. Letters of all sorts, folded and refolded by rain and courage, peeked from the apprentices' sleeves and pockets like small, embarrassed birds. At the gatehouse a woman waited on the step. She was neither young nor old exactly, the kind of age that has learned to hold things with both hands. In her lap she balanced the shoebox of cranes that the child had entrusted to Lyra the night before. Her eyes caught Prometheus's and, without preamble, she took a single crane and opened it between the fingertips. "Somewhere," she said, "a thing will be ready for this." Her voice was a flattened map of many countrysides. "We give them room," Prometheus inclined his head. "We give them room and, sometimes, directions. But the wind chooses the rest." They mounted the steps together. The gate's surface was cooler than the dawn and laced now with new, faintly shining lines, not scars, but new threads where the world had been stitched to itself. The ledger lay on Prometheus's palm like a patient animal. Its pages were less raw than when they had launched it into the sky. Each confession read differently now, as if some of their weight had been transmuted into the small work the city had done. A light stirred within the gate, not an answer but attention. Lyra stepped forward and placed the child's crane on the threshold. The paper did not hesitate. It folded itself inward, as if making a small offering, and the stone received it like a mouth accepting a pinch of salt. Something shifted. The gate hummed, a tone like a cup struck and then set down. the patterns along the arch rearranged into diagrams of paths that unfurled and overlapped. A new opening leaned forward, narrow but honest, a passage that did not lead to some impossible elsewhere but to the quiet rooms where journeys live out their middle acts, kitchens where apologies are practiced on dough, workbenches where hands are taught to hold fragility, hospital wards where the small, steady kind of bravery happens. Prometheus watched the apprentices' faces. The gate offers not only vistas, he said, but workshops. Some journeys are finished not on mountaintops but on worktables, in nights of steady repetition. There is grace in the middle work. Torin, whose beetle still nestled under his collar, looked at the narrow passage and felt a thought like a stone settle. Some paths, he now understood, were less about arrival than about keeping the hands that carried us steady. He stepped forward and felt the gate's cool breath on his skin, a permission rather than a pushing. Eamon lingered at the ledger. He had watched how sentences altered lives, how the smallest, most anonymous honesty could rearrange a neighborhood's rhythm. He traced a line of ink with a forefinger and felt a warmth there he could not name, not pride, not sorrow, but recognition. The gate did not show him a destination, it showed him a tempering. "We are apprentices of return," he murmured. "Not only of leaving." Lyra, whose lark had learned to sing with the exactness of apology, bent and listened to a throb in the gate's stone. For a moment she imagined the arch as a mouth that swallowed unfinished things and turned them into possibility. She thought of the paper boy now entered into the ledger, of the clockmender's quiet repair, of the sisters who would have to carve apology into the shape of actions. "We taught the rain how to be patient," she said, and her voice did not feel like vanity. A small wind gathered, as if the gate sniffed at the air for a new scent. From within that breath came a whisper of a name, not of any person they knew but a label that tugged like a map. The middle way. It was a phrase that had the warmth of a bench in a workshop or a pot of something slow on a stove. It promised not spectacle but the steadiness that makes spectacle unnecessary. Prometheus folded his hands. "You have practiced delivering weather," he said. "Now the world asks you to stay long enough to steward what is returned. The gate's next offerings will require the slow mathematics of tending, calendars, lists, habits. Will you keep that pace?" Silence answered at first, then Torin laughed, a small, startled sound like a bell struck in a deep room. "Well," he said, "we will learn to do the ordinary with extraordinary patience." They passed through the gate and found a courtyard whose stones were carved with dozens of tiny keys, each one labeled with a petty, honest task: mend a hem, listen for 23 minutes, teach a child to tie a knot. The courtyard smelled of turned soy and the first page of several books. Workers, not grand figures but thoughtful people with sleeves rolled and faces open, and moved there, and each one seemed to accept the apprentices with a kind of nod. That meant, "Here, you will learn to persist." Lyra set the shoebox down. The cranes lifted like a small Sai flock and scattered across the courtyard, landing on benches and bellies of pots, their folded forms now tools for the work at hand. The child's gift had not been sent away to some impossible hero. It had become a device, a tonic, a reminder to start again. An old man with hands like folded maps, the same one who had read the ledger, found them in the courtyard. He had returned with a small parcel, a repaired watch, a note that said, "I will come to the theater with you if you will come to my workbench." He smiled at Lyra and Torin and Eamon as if the three of them were the first apprentices at a long, necessary trade. "You brought the weather back," he said. "Now we set it in jars and learn how to feed it steady." Even as they settled, word traveled along the gate's edges. Other travelers arrived with their own small storms. A woman who had kept a last letter and read, a sailor who had folded a map of a route he never took, a child who had sown a tear without telling anyone. The gate did not swallow these things with drama. It offered rooms with benches and kettles and tools, and people who knew the pace of repair. Prometheus watched as apprentices and townspeople bent over the same benches, hands rubbing paper smooth, mouths practicing quiet sentences. He felt something like the gate's own breath match with theirs, no longer a gulf between arrival and departure but a rhythm joined. As the sun swung higher, the apprentices filled out lists on the gate stone, tasks to return to Mistral Ward. Names to find, small promises to keep. They would not be finished by these lists. That was the point. They would become part of an economy of attention, a trade in minutes and acts that did not glitter but did hold weight. Before they set off, the aviary woman, who had come through the gate as if it were a second doorway, leaned close to Lyra. "Don't mistake action for absolution," she said. "Some things mend with getting right, some things mend with being witnessed. The gate gives both shelter." Lyra nodded, folding a crane and tucking it into her collar. "We will be witnesses," she promised. Prometheus stepped back toward the arch one last time, his shadow slender in the now-wide light. "Remember," he said, "unfinished journeys do not demand completion. They demand return." They left the courtyard with hands full of ordinary tasks, and their stride had, somehow, the steadiness of people who had learned to keep their weather warm. Above them, the gate's lines shivered like a harp string, turning small returns into new maps. The world did not resolve into a single ending. It resolved into an endless series of middles, places where people keep showing up, again and again, shaping lives by the quiet geometry of persistent care. A bell from Mistral Ward echoed faintly as they walked back toward the path that led home. Paper wings drifted above the lanes, less urgent now, more certain. The gate hummed something like approval, or perhaps a question lightly scored. "What will you do with what the world asks of you next?" They answered by folding their hands around practical things, thread, lists, a stub of coal for a small stove, and by stepping forward, ready to practice the craft of remaining. They walked down from the gate's courtyard with the smell of warm paper clinging to their sleeves and a list of small, serious errands stitched into the margins of their notebooks. The sun was willing itself into a clean blue, and the gate's hum receded to something like background conversation, no less important, only less insistent. Prometheus fell into step beside them, as if he too had taken on a domestic promise. Their first assignment led them back across Bellweir toward Mistral Ward, a single roof to patch for a widow whose name appeared 3 times in the ledger, always as a margin note. "Forgive me, I could not say it before, I keep the kettle warm." The widow's house crouched under the eaves like a timid animal. Its tiles were thin with rain's old history. Soaring climbed the ladder without spectacle. He felt the weight of his beetle against his chest like a metronome. As he replaced a slate, his hands moved with a patience he had not known he possessed. Lyra handed up nails and a small pot of pitch, humming under her breath. Eamon steadied the ladder with the gentle knots he'd learned the week before. The widow came to the doorway once, watched them work with a face that held a history of starting over, and then returned to her kettle as if the presence of other hands was itself a kind of prayer. When the roof was mended, the ledger asked for something else, a reconciling of a quarrel over a parcel of garden between 2 neighbors. The dispute had been cheap in money and dear in dignity. It smelled, at first, like old stones. The apprentices arranged a meeting at the fence, bringing bread, a small folded bird, and the kind of polite silence that allows truth to find its voice. The man who had claimed the garden spoke in the first minute with the bluntness of long grievance. The woman who defended the soil answered in the second minute with the careful arithmetic of hunger and seed. For a long while they argued like 2 seasons. Lyra listened to the rhythm of their sentences, learned the place where both their voices thinned, and then read aloud, slow and clean, lines from one of the ledger's letters. "We remember wrong so often because remembering is work." It was not eloquence, it was the admission that the ledger had modeled. Naming softened stubbornness. After the bread, after the small laughing concession, that became a shared patch of soil sown with a single packet of beans, the 2 neighbors found themselves apologizing not with fireworks but with an exchange. The man offered a knot he had never thought to share. The woman taught him which seeds keep through drought. The ledger's arithmetic small work returned in kind balanced itself in their hands. Days became a ledger of such middles. The apprentices learned to measure time not by distance traveled, but by tasks completed. 3 loaves baked for the watchman's night, a brass cog machined for the clockmender's stubborn wrist, a lullaby taught to a tired nurse who had forgotten how to hum. Small things, over and over, like stitches that hold a shawl together. Not all repairs were neat. One morning, a bundle of letters arrived at the Aviary tied with twine that smelled faintly of seaweed and something older. Their ink had been written in a hurry, half apologies, half accusations, addressed to a captain who had once taken a ship and left a son waiting at the quay. The son was grown now and had a boat of his own. The captain had a body that had grown older without softer speech. The apprentices debated, return, burn, deliver, and risk rekindling a grievance. Prometheus listened to the calculus and then proposed a path neither sentimental nor cold. They would deliver only after apprenticing for a week with the son, mending ropes, painting planks, learning the language of his life. Care, he reminded them, is not always a yes. Sometimes it is a lesson in presence. They worked with the sun, hands inked and knuckled in varnish, and found that learning the texture of his life made their words different when the letters were finally carried across the gangway. When the father stood on the weathered quarterdeck and read the first apology aloud, his voice cracking with the rust of disuse, what spilled out was not only regret but an attempt at repair shaped by a week of shared labor. The son listened. He did not forgive as a matter of principle, but he accepted the offering of time in exchange. It was neither perfect nor theatrical. It was the slow arithmetic the gate cherished. Sometimes the work asked for endurance rather than cleverness. In the lanes behind the market, a run of 10 doors required new latches because theft had made people lock themselves to their own loneliness. The apprentices divided the list into small segments and, door by door, installed catches and taught neighbors to exchange a watchful knock for a moment of help. The change was small but decisive. A borrowed ladder no longer meant suspicion. It meant the practice of exchange. Through all these tasks, a new ledger grew in the gate's courtyard, not a book of confessions, but a book of practices. They recorded recipes for patience, how to sit with a neighbor's grief when no advice fits, instructions for listening, how long to hold silence so a person can find a forgotten sentence, schematics for mending, how to stitch a hem so it sings instead of binding. It was not law. It was a manual of the ordinary, written in hands and then tempered by use. There were frictions. A deputation from a neighboring town, a place more given to resolutions and proclamations, arrived and asked to catalogue the gate's methods, to freeze them into a program. Their maps were neat, their expectations immediate. The apprentices invited them to spend a week in the oven, the boatyard, and the night watch. 2 of the deputation left embittered. 1 remained and learned to tie a knot that saved a life during a sudden squall. The visitors departed with less certainty than they had wished, but perhaps with a seed of patience planted quietly in their pockets. Lyra, Torin, and Aemon each bore small private reckonings. Lyra found herself writing thin letters not for delivery, but as practice, a sentence a day that claimed a truth, folded and placed inside the ledger to be read later on the long evenings. Torin caught himself humming a rhythm that the beetle tapped when he slept. It steadied his temper. Aemon began teaching a class to children in the gate's courtyard how to fold a paper bird so that it will carry not only an apology but also an intention. The children learned quickly that paper is honest if you are, on a certain dusk, when the gate's stone shone with the memory of 1,000 small returns, a woman arrived who did not appear in any ledger. She wore a coat patch with different maps sewn together, and she carried a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Her hands trembled not with age but with the fatigue of too many tasks unfinished. Prometheus met her at the archway, and she spoke without preamble. I was a cartographer once, she said. I made maps people used to go away. Somewhere along the edges, I stopped drawing home routes. I have drawn a map I cannot follow. She unrolled a scrap no larger than a placard. On it were routes that ended not in starbursts, but in small symbols, chairs, kettles, benches, places where people stayed. I want my maps to teach people how to remain. Prometheus handled the scrap as if it were fragile scripture. That is a rare sort of map, he murmured. Most maps are good at sending. Few teach how to tarry. The woman's arrival set a small fire under their work. They began, in the coming weeks, to chart what permanence looked like in Mistral Ward, a bench that was always polished for those who needed to sit, a kettle that was always on, a ledger that was left open in a public place for people to read and add to. The gate's courtyard became the place where itinerant practices met municipal life. It was less the icing on civic virtue and more the yeast slow rising. Not everything was gentle. A rumor spread about a merchant who had profited from turning the gate's workshops into spectacle, charging for lessons, selling authentic. Not everything was gentle. A rumor spread about a merchant who had profited from turning the gate's workshops into spectacle, charging for lessons, selling authentic paper wings stamped with the gate's sigil. People in the ward were angry and some wanted rules. The apprentices convened a meeting where the ledger's practices were read aloud. They decided, after long discussion, to open the workshops to all who would apprentice in return and to leave the gate's instruction free at core. They also instituted a small, Public list of names those who had profited by mimicry without labor so the community could choose where to give its trust. It was not law but accountability, a practice that required its own maintenance. Months slipped in this way, small acts folded into larger habits. Children who had once only known how to pack their toys into neat boxes learned to fold a letter and set it by a windowsill. Elders found new faces to teach, and in teaching, they found rediscovered relevance. The gate's work settled like a good tune under the city's daily hum, and as they practiced staying, patches of the gate's lessons began to show in distant places. A message arrived wrapped in reeds. A town 3 valleys over had begun its own bench project after reading a fragment of the gate's ledger. A sea captain sent a scrap of sail, repaired with a knot he had learned from Torin, and tucked into it a line. We kept the promise to be present. Each item that returned carried with it a small mutation and adjustment to fit another life's weather, and they welcomed those mutations as part of the gate's living grammar. One evening late, copper dust, Prometheus gathered the apprentices by the ledger and said, quietly, "You have been learning the gate's middle work. The gate will offer a test now, not for heroism, but for endurance." They did not imagine anything theatrical. The test, when it came, was humble and demanding. A season of harvests gone wrong in 3 neighboring hamlets, triggered by a blight that ate at storage grain. The hamlets were far enough that travel cost time and thin hands, close enough that the gate's network could matter. The apprentices were asked to coordinate, to teach storage technique, to sit up through the nights teaching the proper airing of grain, the folding of sacks to keep moisture from creeping in, the barter of seeds that stood firm in damp climes. It was grinding work. They left at dawn. They returned at dusk. They slept like people who had exchanged a life for a day. Rain fell in the 2nd week and then the 3rd, and their patched clothes gathered the smell of earth. The ledger expanded with lists, names of families taught, months of storage mapped, knots that held in wet weather, recipes for seed mixes. The gate watched. Stone shifted, not in judgment but in a slow shaping of pride. When the hamlet's granaries filled enough again to sow, and the children learned to make a bread that would not spoil in humid months, the apprentices came back thinner and somehow fuller. Their endurance had altered the arc of a small region's winter. They had not performed a miracle. They had practiced until the weather bent in ways that favored life. Prometheus set the ledger aside that night and looked at them in a light that was neither teachers nor superiors, but something equal, like an artisan proud of someone who had learned. The gate's lessons do not end in spectacle, he said. They end in the mundane that keeps people awake and fed. You have learned to be ordinary in clearest ways. They slept that night in the gate's courtyard under a hung map that the cartographer woman had stitched, a network not of roads but of benches, kettles, and watchposts. The map was, like them, unfinished ribbons of thread waiting to be tugged into new places. Morning came. A child from Mistral Ward arrived breathless at the gate with a small bundle of letters she had written on her own, 3 sentences each, awkward and bright. She handed them to Lyra and said plainly, "My teacher said you might know how to make them travel kinder." Lyra folded each letter into a swallow and tucked them into the ledger's new pages. She thought of the roofs mended, the gardens shared, the granaries aired. She thought of the beetles' rhythm under Torin's collar and of Eamon's commas turned into swallows. She thought of Prometheus' face, the coal and the compass, and felt a patience settle into her like a garment she had finally learned to wear. "Bring me the weather of where you want them to go," she told the child. Names, windows, a kettle where someone might read them. The child's eyes widened. She rattled off 3 names to living, 1 a promise to a mother still away at work. Lyra slid the swallows from the ledger and sent them up with a small wind conjured by all their combined attention. The paper birds rose, and Mistral Ward watched them pass like a private parade. Prometheus watched too, and when the last swallow went, he said, softly, "We are not only apprentices of leaving and returning, we are apprentices of attention. That is the gate's truest craft." The apprentices kept moving, their days a score of small acts. The gate's influence expanded not by decree but by habit, people learning to set aside minutes for another's speech, to practice apology as craftsmanship, to fold weather into birds and let the rain read the truth. And somewhere, beyond hills and tides, letters returned with added flourishes, a new knot, a different recipe, a corrected stitch. Each return added to the ledger not only content but method. It went on this way, the ordinary made resilient, the minor acts magnified. By repetition, The gate remained, quietly, an instrument whose music now included the steady heartbeat of people who chose to remain in the middle of things. Prometheus continued to listen, and sometimes, when the apprentices' hands were empty and their feet were steady, he would take a small folded bird and set it on his palm, watching it open and sing like a clock wound for kindness. And in the stone's cool pattern, somewhere between the carved lines and the faintly glowing threads, a new sigil took shape, not a gate alone, but a clasp, a small device that fastens to loose edges into a seam. It was not dramatic, it did not need to be, it was the gate's way of saying that the world's work, once learned, becomes a quiet habit, a way of binding people together so that when weather comes, paper wings may fly. They learned, in time, that steadiness breeds a kind of authority no proclamation can buy. People came to the gate not because a sign said service hours, but because the courtyard had become, by repetition, a place where the small work of being human was practiced openly, where someone would sit with you while you tried to say a hard sentence, where a pot of stew was set on the stoop for a night, where a child could be taught to fold a letter that would not be ashamed to travel. One morning, as a thin mist still clung to the gate's lower stones, a delegation arrived from a town beyond the marshes, not officials this time, but a ragged band of teachers and slow toolsmiths who carried with them a petition stitched into old sailcloth. They had seen a swallow, one of Lyra's paper birds, fly over their roofs days ago, and it had landed in the hands of a woman who could not read but who nonetheless sensed an invitation. The teachers had come because the woman had asked for a bench that would always be kept warm for anyone who needed to say the thing that hurt them most. They wanted to learn how to build such benches. They wanted to learn the ledger's measures. Soaring and Aemon met them on the gate steps. The teachers spoke in the clear, practical sentences of people who make things and keep people. Tell us the stitch that holds, the hour to keep open, the song to hum when a hand trembles. Soaring showed them the knot that would not slip in wet months. Aemon taught the rhythm, 23 minutes, neither too long nor too short, that made listening feel like a craft. Lyra folded a series of small cranes and placed them on the petition, a way of saying, "We will teach you how to carry weather." They began to itinerate in earnest. Weeks that once might have been filled with the private study of magic or the trimming of ropes now dissolved into roots. A morning teaching a widow's circle how to keep a hearth from choking on smoke, an afternoon spent showing a school how to fold a complaint into a form that could be carried without shaming the carrier, an evening at the quay where sailors were taught to nod in ways that allowed an apology to be handed over in the same motion as a line. The ledger grew. So did the list of people who knew its pages by heart, not as scripture, but as recipes. The gate's courtyard accumulated objects that served the middle work, a kettle that always had spare tea, a shelf of needles and thread labeled with names and dates, a mounted board where anyone could pin a small task for a neighbor. Children learned to check the board with the seriousness of small clerks. Habits nested into habits until the courtyard itself read like a patient manual for the ordinary life. Change does not travel in one direction. One damp afternoon, a woman arrived at the gate bearing a cloak trimmed with brass coins, each engraved with a neat cipher. She introduced herself as a promoter of charity, a merchant who had grown wealthy selling the idea of salvation in exchange for a small token. Her eyes glinted with the neat calculus of value. What if the gate's methods were taught in exchange for coin? She asked. What if every bench, every lesson, every ledger entry could be deskilled and sold as a certificate? The apprentices listened. It was not a foolish question. Many good systems are ruined by being too easily packaged. Lyra answered first, quietly. "We can teach the stitch," she said, "but not the reason someone would keep their hands in it when it is cold." Soaring added, "You can buy a knot, but you cannot buy the patience that makes it hold." Aemon, who had learned to fold words into birds that would not be ashamed, placed a swallow on the promoter's palm. The bird tilted its head and then folded itself into a small, stubborn shape. "We don't sell wings," he said. "We teach how to make them fly." The promoter left without the merchant's contracts she had expected. She left a ledger card in the courtyard with a polite note and offered to sponsor apprenticeships if they would only accept the terms. The gate accepted the card into its stack and set a small practice in motion instead. Any sponsorship would be matched by a season of unpaid apprenticeship offered to someone who could not otherwise afford it. The clause was not rhetoric. It was a small iron rule, like a knot with teeth. It kept the merchants honest and the gate patient. Autumn slid into a quieter kind of economy. The apprentices started to catalog the returns that mattered most, not money but measures of repair. A count of roofs mended, names of people who had returned letters instead of hoarding them, the number of benches that kept a kettle warm each week. They would bring these numbers to the gate stone and read them aloud once a month, not as a tally for applause but as a way to remember the arithmetic of care. Prometheus watched these rituals without command. One evening, when the northern light had thinned and the apprentices were closing the day's ledger, he called them to the gate's rim. His hand was empty. "You have learned how weather travels," he said. "You have learned where to plant it. There is one thing the gate will ask you next, and it is smaller than you expect." They leaned in. They had come to expect tests, had the shape of storms or voyages. Prometheus smiled with a softness that made the stone seem to listen more closely. "It will ask you to be boring," he said, "to do the same small work so often that it becomes a muscle. There is a kind of courage that looks suspiciously like habit." They laughed soft, incredulous, but when the laughter faded the truth settled like ash. The gate did not need grand declarations. It needed people who would show up to the bench at the same hour every Tuesday so that someone might be able to remember to come. Winter arrived with a thin edge. The apprentices kept their hours. They heated kettles, mended hems, taught knots to ridiculous, stubborn novices. The cartographer woman stitched more maps, not of roads but of gatherings, where a bench might be needed in January. Who would watch the loom when a mother went to the midwife? Which house could feed an extra mouth without tipping the scales? The gate hummed approval in secret frequencies, and the gate's clasp, a symbol of small binding work, was stitched onto a scarf by a child who had learned to sew on mornings she had once spent alone. There were losses. A keeper who had tied knots for 39 years took his last breath in a room where an apprentice held his hand and read aloud a ledger entry the man had once written as joke. "Teach the knot that will pull someone back from the dark." The man's fingers relaxed. He smiled like someone who had closed a small, meaningful book. Grief was worked into the gate's craft not as a tragedy but as a lesson. You do not harden against sorrow. You build a bench to sit on with it. And then on a morning washed pale with frost the gate changed hands in a manner that was not ceremony so much as simple passing. Prometheus, who had been both fire and compass, stood with the apprentices and the courtyard people and pressed the ledger into Lyra's hands. "I have a road to walk where the clouds are thin," he said. "You have the weather now." Lyra felt the ledger's weight, not heavy like duty but weighty like a tool. "Will you come back?" she asked, a small, private fear. Prometheus folded his cloak around him and shook his head only once, the way someone might settle an agreeable knot. "Perhaps," he said, "but if I do, I will come as a student. The gate is not mine to keep. It is ours to tend." He left with a handful of paper wings tied to his staff. They fluttered and rose, scattering like small promises down the road he chose. The apprentices watched until the dust took him in. When he was gone, they did not feel abandoned. They felt oddly authorized. The gate waited, as gates have waited, since stone learned the language of thresholds. The courtyard turned its face to the weather. Children ran errands, neighbors learned to sit and wait. People learned to fold their fears into shapes the rain could carry without dissolving. The clasp stitched itself into the gate's pattern and into the shape of the city's days. Months later, a swallow returned with a new line written across its tail. "We kept the bench warm." The words were small, imperfect, and utterly true. Lyra read them aloud at the gate as apprentices and townsfolk clustered close. Their breath made a small fog. Someone laughed. Someone began to cry softly. The world did not end. It continued, stitched by the habits of people who kept returning. Prometheus's road had gone past hills and rivers by then. Somewhere on it he might have paused to set a bird in a window, to teach a fisherman a knot that would not slip when rain came thick. He would keep learning, as they would keep staying. The gate did not require his mythic presence, it required the stubborn practice of ordinary hands. Chapter 13 did not conclude with a trumpet or a final revelation. It concluded, if such a chapter can be said to have an end, by teaching them what the gate had always tried to teach, that unfinished journeys ask for return, and that the art of return is not an ecstatic event but a lifetime of small, patient stitches. The apprentices folded another page into the ledger, and a child from Mistral Ward slipped a paper crane onto its binding. The crane leaned into the wind and, for once, did not fear the rain. They built a rhythm out of small interruptions, the sort of life that reads dull on a map but quiets the heart when you live it. Lyra learned to wake by the ledger's edge and listen for the first faint bird voices of Confession's Landing. Torin kept a chest of spare nuts and a battered all he would offer to anyone who showed up with a stubborn hem. Aemon taught children how to fold intent into a wing and how to tell the difference between a boast wrapped in paper and an apology that would travel. Months took on the texture of craft. The courtyard's bench list grew. A woman now came every Thursday to teach the apprentices how to steam stubborn stains out of old clothing so hands that needed dignity could have it. An old clockmaker repaired a shelf of broken letter openers so that the reading of a truth would no longer tear its reader. A seamstress set up a small counter where anyone could leave a mending request with the ledger and find it tended within a fortnight. These were not heroic acts, they were an accumulation of attention. The gate absorbed them and, in its stone way, became steadier each day. One autumn morning a messenger arrived with news that unsettled the courtyard. A flood upriver had taken the roof from a village that traded pottery and woven baskets. Their storm cellar had been flooded with the season's storeroom. Seed and records were sodden. There were no theatrics attached to the plea, only a short, soaked note with the village's seal and a line in the margin. Teach us what will keep us through this winter. Lyra and Torin set out that afternoon, the ledger tucked beneath Lyra's coat like a small lit animal. Aemon stayed to hold the gate's hours. The children who had learned to fold a bird that could carry a name now practiced sending requests downriver through the postbox the gate had kept, small paper ropes with notes tucked like fish. The village was worse than the note suggested: roofs peeled like old bark, smoke damp in the air, and a wind that made conversation into shouted stitches. The apprentices did not arrive with grand answers. Instead they taught what they knew: how to stack grain off the ground in slatted racks, how to tie sacks so damp would run harmlessly down seams, how to boil a stew that could conceal a day's ration for two. They taught knots that could be undone in a hurry and stitches that held a hem from rotting in wet weather. They taught a way to leave a bench outside the granary where a neighbor could sit while another's back labored. At dusk the village gathered around a pot. A woman with hands that had once braided festival crowns asked Lyra, without preamble, if the gate ever accepted mistakes. Lyra, ledger heavy in her lap, answered simply, "It depends on what you do after you know the mistake." The woman's answer was a quiet nod and the careful lifting of a ladle. Weeks folded into this kind of steady doing. The apprentices came home thin with work and full with new quiet knowledge. They had learned that care sometimes meant being practical, sometimes meant standing in a doorway and listening until someone found the sentence inside themselves. They learned, too, that the gate's influence rippled unpredictably. A technique for airing grain taught on a clay floor returned months later as a new variation, better for high humidity, sent by a neighbor who had taught someone halfway across the valley. Not every return was kind. One night a man came to the gate with a letter that smelled faintly of tobacco and old thunder. He asked them, in an unsteady voice, to deliver it to a magistrate in the city beyond the marsh. The letter accused a miller of hoarding sedan, accusation that, if true, would ruin the miller and perhaps save a village. Torin looked at the man's hands. They trembled not only from cold. "Why me?" the man asked. "Why the gate?" "Because you brought a thing that wants to be read with care," Lyra said. They did not deliver immediately. They apprenticed with the miller for 3 days. They sifted through grain, learned his ledger of weights, smelled the air of his storeroom. The miller was a blunt man with soft hands. His ledger had smudges that came from working late, and on his face the apprentices read small exhaustion rather than calculated cruelty. When the accusation was finally carried, it was not with the righteous abruptness of a decree but with the patience of one who had learned the measure of another's hours. The magistrate did not revel in punishing. He ordered a careful audit, repairs to leaky storehouses, and a meeting between village elders and the miller in which work was promised and watched. The letter's rough edge had been softened by presence. The gate had not refused consequence, it had delayed spectacle. In favor of repair, that delay became a lesson for Aemon. He had always loved the idea of a neat answer, a tidy delivery. The gate taught him patiently, with the clink of cups and the rumble of the potter's wheel, that often the right thing is to sit in the slow company of others until accusations either reveal themselves or dissolve under the light of shared labor. Winter returned in a sting, this time ice that made rope brittle, ink that froze in nibs. The apprentices kept the gate's hours, a warm kettle, a seat for someone who needed to practice a hard sentence, a patch for every thin pair of gloves that came through. In the still hours between snows, Lyra read the ledger by lamplight. New entries had arrived, small notations from the hamlets they had helped, detailing things done, times measured, children taught. The ledger had grown into an atlas of attention. 1. Dusk when the courtyard lights burned low, a child from the ward slipped a folded paper into Lyra's hand. It was a map drawn with a careful, earnest hand, roads, benches, kettles marked, and a single new symbol near the gate, a tiny clasp. The mark that had begun to appear on scarves and ladders and the corners of the ledger. At the edge the child had written, in a scrawl both fearless and shy, "We keep a bench for those who come back." Lyra placed the map into the ledger and then, without telling the apprentices, went to the gate's arch. She pressed her palm into the cool stone where the clasp had been touched most often. For a moment she felt nothing, then a faint warmth like a return handshake. It was not magic, not exactly, it was practice given form. She smiled with a small honesty. The gate listened to what was kept. Spring arrived not as thunder but as a series of small returns. Prometheus, who sometimes sent news on paper wings that smelled of distant coals, sent a note. He had found a place where the sky was thin and the people kept benches by long canals. He would be teaching there for a time. He had folded into his lines a request. Would the gate send a teacher who knew the habit of listening when rain blurred ink? Lyra answered from the ledger, no flourish, only a named hour and a nod for travel. They apprenticed teachers now as well as townsfolk. People arrived at the gate with the intent to learn how to remain. A priest from a roadside chapel who wanted his sermons to be less like proclamations and more like invitations. A midwife who wanted a bench for new mothers. A schoolmaster who wanted children to learn how to say the truth without fear. The gate's courtyard became a place where the habit of return was taught like a craft, stitch by stitch, sentence by sentence. Years wound their slow way past. Children who had learned to fold apology into a swallow became young people who could hold a neighbor's grief without flinching. The cartographer woman's maps multiplied into a ragged atlas of places with benches and kettles and watchposts. The clasp motif threaded itself into everyday objects: on the corner of a pot, on the edge of a letter, in the braid of a rope, so that the gate's lesson could be carried home as easily as a useful tool. One evening, years after Prometheus had set off down the thin road he favored, a shadow fell across the courtyard. Not the dramatic kind of shadow, but the ordinary kind that comes when someone stops. A traveler moved through the archway, neither wealthy nor ragged, simply tired the way roads make people tired. He carried a box that clanged softly when he walked. He placed it on the ledger sill and opened it. Inside were dozens of small metal clasps, simple, honest things, each one stamped with a single word. Bench, kettle, nail, listen, return. "I thought," he said, voice like pebbles rubbed smooth, "that places needed locks. But I found some places needed clasps to hold what people stitched together. I thought maybe you'd like these." Lyra reached for one and found, as if in a small mirror, how the gate had changed. It had never been about gates and guarding alone. It had been about holding things close enough to care for them, and loose enough to let them move. She slipped the metal clasp onto the ledger's binding. They spent that night fitting clasps to benches, to kettles, to the ledger itself. Each clasp was a promise that what was begun here would be held with ordinary hands. The travelers slept in a spare bed near the aviary, and left in the morning with a kettle of hot tea and a list of places he would visit to teach how to make clasps. The rains did not stop, not that spring, nor the next. They came in long veils, soft and unrelenting, as if the sky itself had decided to test whether paper wings could endure endless weight. Yet within the gate's courtyard, the sound of dripping water became a kind of metronome to which life adjusted. Roofs were patched with care, buckets stationed beneath the leaks. And still, every dawn, wings were folded, messages written, knots tied. The rain was no longer only an enemy. It was a stern teacher, forcing each gesture to be deliberate. Lyra discovered that the ink itself began to behave differently when the air was always wet. She experimented, mixing ash into the pigment, thickening it so the letters clung stubbornly to their fibers. Torin, meanwhile, learned how to wax the paper wings, brushing them lightly with oils so that they shed droplets, like feathers. And Aemon, ever the dreamer, set about carving slender ribs from reeds to strengthen the wings so they could bear both rain and the weight of unspoken words. But what surprised them most was not their own ingenuity. It was the resilience of those who arrived at the gate. Villagers came soaked through, clutching messages against their chests, pleas, apologies, small declarations of love, believing that even drenched words deserved to fly. Children arrived barefoot, their laughter mingling with the rain, eager to fold the scraps of paper into forms that seemed, impossibly, to rise against the wet air. One evening, when thunder rolled close to the hills, a stranger stepped through the arch of the gate, cloaked in sodden wool. His presence seemed less arrival than emergence, as though the rain itself had shaped him. He introduced himself as Nerai, a keeper of storms. His voice was quiet, but in it was the sound of rivers in flood, of branches snapping under the weight of water. "The rain does not fall to drown you," he said, setting his staff upon the stones. "It falls to ask whether your wings are honest enough to carry what must endure." He watched as Lyra unrolled the ledger, the ink smudged in places where water had crept in. He touched one of the clasps that now bound it, and for a moment the rain seemed to pause, suspended as if listening. "You are learning," he whispered, "not to resist the storm, but to speak through it." From that night, the gate's work deepened. It was no longer only about carrying messages across distance, but about teaching resilience, the art of crafting words, lives, and gestures that did not dissolve in hardship. The apprentices began to say to newcomers, "Write not as if the page is fragile, but as if the world must read it through a veil of water." The courtyard filled with voices that echoed not only across valleys but through time. Children who once folded paper swallows now taught their younger siblings. Villagers who had come seeking help returned, bringing new methods, ways to waterproof a roof, ways to keep grain from molding, ways to preserve seeds against another season of storms. And as the rains went on, the gate stood not as a place of waiting, but as a living testament. Paper wings could survive the storm, so long as they were folded with honesty and held with care. As weeks turned into months, the gate of unfinished journeys became a labyrinth of paper wings. Each flap, each carefully folded edge, carried stories of sorrow, courage, and unspoken dreams. Lyra began to notice that some wings, despite the rain, seemed to hum softly, as if the fibers themselves remembered voices of those who had long since left the village. She called it the resonance of memory, and she spent hours listening, trying to discern patterns in the delicate vibrations. Torin, meanwhile, experimented with flight paths through the courtyard, mapping arcs and currents that the soaked wings could navigate. The children followed him eagerly, laughing as they discovered that even a heavy, waterlogged wing could soar if released with just the right timing and angle. The courtyard became a theater of learning, where every gust of wind was both teacher and challenge. Aemon, still carving and shaping the structural ribs of the wings, found new inspiration in the rain itself. He began to collect droplets in small glass spheres, then studied how light passed through them. Soon, he created luminous wings that, when folded and carried, reflected the dim light of stormy evenings, casting miniature rainbows across the courtyard. Travelers who arrived after dark marveled at the effect, calling it a promise of hope. Even amid relentless downpours. One morning, a messenger arrived, soaked and shivering, carrying a note that trembled in his hand. The words were simple but urgent. "The winds beyond the hills are shifting. Prepare the wings for what is to come." The apprentices and villagers exchanged glances, feeling a pulse of anticipation ripple through the rain-heavy air. Neroi appeared once more, emerging from the downpour as though he had grown from the storm itself. "The rains are teaching you patience," he said, "but soon you will need courage. Wings that endure water can also endure wind, and winds carry truths that are heavier than any droplet." The gate's courtyard seemed to expand, the paper wings multiplying, each bearing a piece of someone's heart. Villagers no longer folded their messages only for themselves. They folded them for strangers, for distant valleys, for futures yet unknown. Every wing that lifted into the wet air was a small act of defiance against despair, a whisper to the world that even fragile things could matter. And amid it all, Lyra realized something remarkable. The rain, once an adversary, had become a collaborator. Each drop that weighed the wings down also polished them, strengthened their fibers, made the ink cling more persistently. The storm, it seemed, had always intended not to destroy, but to perfect. As the rain drummed steadily on the gate's stones, Lyra discovered another secret hidden within the wings. Some of the papers, after days of soaking, began to ripple with tiny, almost imperceptible patterns, lines, and shapes that only revealed themselves when held at certain angles to the dim light. She traced these patterns with her fingers, realizing they formed miniature maps, pathways through forests, secret streams, hidden groves. The gate was teaching them not only how to endure storms, but how to find hidden truths within them. Torin, ever restless, began experimenting with coordinated flights of multiple wings. He would gather groups of children and instruct them to release their paper creations simultaneously, timing each release to match gusts of wind. When done correctly, the wings formed fleeting constellations above the courtyard, shimmering in the wet twilight like ephemeral stars. Villagers gasped at the beauty, calling it the dance of endurance. Amen, inspired by these discoveries, began carving miniature charms to attach to the wings, small tokens of luck, tiny symbols of courage, and protective runes. He whispered to the apprentices that each charm would help the wings carry not only messages but the intentions of their makers, ensuring that the hopes and dreams embedded in paper could survive the harshest storms. One evening, Neroi appeared. With a rare, almost reverent expression, he brought a small, carved vessel filled with rainwater from the highest peak in the hills. "This," he said, "is the essence of endurance itself. Sprinkle it over your wings, and they will carry truths no ordinary storm could erase." Lyra, Torin, and Aemon watched as he performed the ritual, the raindrops sparkling like liquid starlight. The next day, travelers came from distant lands, drawn by whispers of the gate and its miraculous wings. They brought stories of their own storms, of floods, of winds that tore through villages. In return, they received wings, folded carefully with messages of hope and guidance, empowered by the lessons of the gate. Each paper that took flight carried with it the echoes of many hands, many hearts, and the quiet magic of perseverance. Lyra stood in the courtyard, soaked to the bone, watching a single wing float skyward. It glimmered faintly in the gray light, a testament to patience, creativity, and the quiet strength of those who refused to let storms break them. And as the rain continued, she realized that the Gate of Unfinished Journeys was not just a place, it was a living story, ever growing, ever changing, and never truly complete. The rain seemed endless, a constant curtain between the gate and the hills beyond. Yet within the courtyard, life pulsed with a quiet determination. Lyra wandered among rows of paper wings pinned to drying lines, each one a tiny testament to hope. Some were simple triangles, folded by trembling hands. Others were intricate swans, dragons, or fantastical birds with curling tails and feathered crests. Even when the rain seeped through the roofs, the wings endured, their folds stiffened with wax and careful care, each one carrying a story that refused to be erased. Torin had begun teaching the children a secret art, the flight of synchronized wings. He marked circles on the wet stones, each a landing point, and instructed the young ones in timing, rhythm, and release. "The rain is your partner," he said. "It does not fight you, it shapes you." The children laughed as their first attempts splashed into puddles, but gradually, the wings began to skim across the courtyard, bouncing lightly, as if riding invisible currents. By nightfall, the paper formations resembled constellations, floating above them in glimmering arcs, a reflection of the stars hidden behind storm clouds. Aemon, always the craftsman, began experimenting with new materials, inspired by the rain itself. He mixed resin from river stones into his ink, creating a glossy layer that resisted water. He carved slender, reed-like frames for the wings, bending them into shapes that could catch the wind yet remain pliable. By doing so, the wings could carry not just letters, but small charms, seeds, or tiny scrolls, allowing messages to travel farther than ever before. Each creation was both functional and beautiful, and he sometimes whispered to them as he worked, as though they might listen and respond. One day, a sudden hush fell over the courtyard. Lyra looked up to see a figure stepping through the archway, cloaked in a flowing robe that seemed wet with rain yet shimmered as if it had been spun from the clouds themselves. Neroi, the keeper of storms, had returned. But this time, his presence was different. It carried an urgency. "The storms beyond these hills are changing," he said, voice low and resonant. "They will test not only your wings, but the strength of your hearts. You must prepare." He held up a small, translucent crystal filled with water, suspended by silver chains. "This is rain from the peaks of the Whispering Mountains," he explained. It contains memories of storms past. Sprinkle it on your wings, and they will remember how to endure, how to rise when the wind is strongest. Lyra accepted the crystal reverently, pouring droplets over a newly folded swan wing. The paper shivered, stiffened, and then seemed to lift slightly on its own, as though it had absorbed a fragment of the storm's memory. That night, as the rain fell heavier than ever, the gate became a sanctuary of stories. Villagers arrived with messages soaked through, letters torn by wind and water, yet they still clung to them. Each note was carefully wrapped, folded, and affixed to a wing. Some carried apologies, others carried love, some bore instructions. For distant family members or friends, the apprentices worked tirelessly, sewing, gluing, and folding. They whispered words of encouragement to the wings, as if speaking directly to the people who would one day hold them. Amid the rain, something extraordinary began to occur. The wings themselves seemed to hum a soft vibration that resonated through the courtyard, a sound like distant bells or the murmur of a hidden river. Lyra pressed her hand against a particularly large wing and felt a warmth she could not explain, as though the paper remembered the touch of its maker and the journey it was destined to take. "The wings are alive," she whispered to Torin, "not with flesh, but with memory." Torin smiled, rain dripping from his hair. "And that is why they survive the storm. They carry more than words, they carry intention, courage, and love. The rain cannot erase that." Aemon, meanwhile, experimented with luminescence, dipping wings in crushed crystals that refracted the dim light. As night fell, the courtyard glowed with hundreds of floating, glimmering forms, paper wings casting kaleidoscopic reflections onto the whetstones. Villagers looked up in awe. "It is a sky of our own making," said a child, her voice trembling. With wonder. The following morning, a messenger arrived on horseback, dripping from head to toe. He handed a note to Lyra. "Beyond the hills, the wind carries more than rain. Prepare your wings." The apprentices exchanged solemn looks, understanding that their work would soon be tested. Nera nodded gravely. "The storms are not finished. Neither is the journey." From that day on, the gate became more than a place of learning. It was a forge of resilience. Children learned patience, adults learned hope. Every flapped wing, every folded corner, every soaked letter became a ritual, a hymn to perseverance. Even the rain seemed to recognize their efforts, softening at times, rushing at others, but never ceasing entirely, teaching them that endurance was born not in calm, but in struggle. And as the winds shifted and the first hints of a distant storm swept through the valley, Lyra realized that the gate's true purpose had always been this: to teach that even the most fragile of things, a paper wing, a whispered hope, a soaked letter, can rise above the tempest, carrying with it the courage of those who dare to fold, release, and believe. The rain had not relented since dawn, yet the courtyard was alive with movement. Lyra's hands trembled as she folded the delicate paper wings, each crease a silent hope. Around her, the apprentices laughed and whispered, the sound mingling with the endless rhythm of falling water. The wings, though fragile, seemed to respond to their emotions, fluttering as if infused with life. Torin stepped forward, his cloak dripping, eyes glinting with quiet wisdom. "The rain tests them," he said softly. "It will try to weigh them down, to destroy what is not strong enough. But the wings that endure are proof that resilience is born from fragility." Lyra released her first wing. It rose, spun, and dipped in the downpour, then steadied itself, catching a stray beam of light that turned the droplets around it into tiny sparks. She released another, and then another, until the courtyard shimmered with floating fragments of paper, each a testament to persistence. From the shadows, Aemon whispered an incantation, and the wings glowed faintly, resisting the storm, forming patterns that mirrored constellations above. The rain was no longer an obstacle. It had become a collaborator, etching beauty into their fragile creations. The apprentices watched in awe, realizing that even the simplest paper, in the midst of a storm, could carry dreams higher than they had imagined. And somewhere deep inside, each of them understood that the journey of their wings had only just begun. The rain had grown steadier, a silver curtain draping the courtyard. Each droplet seemed alive, carrying whispers of forgotten dreams and unspoken wishes. Lyra knelt, folding another paper wing, her fingers trembling as if the act itself was sacred. The wings were delicate, almost too fragile to survive the storm, yet each crease she made was a testament to hope's stubborn persistence. Around her, the apprentices moved like dancers caught in the rhythm of the rain. Every wing they released wavered, spun, and then soared, as though the storm itself had given them life. Some dipped into puddles, their wet edges shimmering like liquid silver, while others rose higher, catching fleeting beams of light that split the raindrops into tiny constellations. Torin watched silently, rain-soaked and patient. "The storm is not your enemy," he said at last, voice low but clear. "It shapes what is true. Only what bends without breaking, what rises despite weight, will find its way." Amen. Standing beneath the arch of the Gate of Unfinished Journeys, murmured, charms that fluttered into the wings like invisible threads of magic. The glowing patterns traced themselves across the paper, symbols of resilience, courage, and the delicate strength of belief. Lyra's heart soared as she observed the wings forming spirals and arcs, weaving patterns across the courtyard that mirrored the stars above. Even the heaviest rain could not extinguish their glow. Instead, it highlighted their beauty, forcing each shimmer to shine brighter. Time seemed suspended. The storm, the wings, the laughter and whispers of apprentices all existed in a suspended, ethereal space where fragility and strength danced together. Each wing carried a story, a memory, a hope. And as they rose, twisting and glinting under the rain, the children realized that they were not merely watching paper take flight, they were witnessing the physical manifestation of perseverance, courage, and dreams unbroken by circumstance. And in that moment, Lyra understood the true lesson of the rain. The storm did not destroy the wings, it revealed them. Every fold, every charm, every shimmer told of a journey that was still unfolding. A story unfinished but beautiful in its resilience. The rain was no longer an obstacle, it was a melody, a collaborator, an artist painting their fragile creations across the world. As the rain continued, the courtyard transformed into a shimmering ocean of paper wings, each one carrying a silent story. Lyra knelt beside a small puddle, watching the reflection of a wing dip and rise, and felt a curious stirring in her chest. Each wing seemed to hold a fragment of herself, her fears, her courage, her unspoken dreams. Torin approached, water dripping from his cloak, his eyes calm but intense. "Every storm tests what we hold inside," he said, voice like distant thunder. "The paper is fragile, but the intent behind it gives it strength. So too with us, our heart must fold courage into our fragility if we wish to rise." The apprentices moved in a quiet rhythm, hands busy folding and releasing wings. Laughter mingled with the patter of raindrops, and soon the courtyard seemed to hum with energy. Each wing twisted and spun, catching the storm's wind in ways that seemed impossible for something so delicate. Amen whispered charms that twined around the wings, glimmers of light that resisted the rain's weight. The paper became more than paper, it became a vessel for magic, for hope, for perseverance. Lyra released another wing and watched it climb, dancing above the others, weaving itself into the patterns, forming a tapestry of light and motion. The storm's roar softened as twilight approached, the rain turning from torrent to gentle drizzle. In that quiet moment, Lyra realized that the wings were not just a test, they were a mirror. Each one reflected the strength to endure, the capacity to dream, and the beauty that emerges when courage meets fragility. The Gate of Unfinished Journeys loomed behind them, silent but alive, as if acknowledging that this was only the beginning. Lyra smiled, feeling a warmth amidst the wet chill. Every wing, every shimmer, every small triumph in the rain was a promise. No journey, no matter how stormy, was ever truly over. And in that realization, she understood that the storm itself had become a teacher, guiding each wing and each heart toward the sky.